By law, the current and highly popular Mexican president, Andrés Manuel Lopez Obrador, cannot run for another term in next year's general election, and he's vowed not to try. Still, moves such as the changes to election law made recently by his government, but stymied by the courts, have critics worried that he is positioning his party to revive a kind of one-party rule that threatens Mexican democracy. Let's get into that, shall we? With, in Mexico City, Lorena Becerra, political analyst and the head of public opinion research for one of Mexico's leading newspapers, Reforma. In Washington, D.C., David Frum, staff writer at The Atlantic magazine. And in Ithaca, New York, Gustavo Flores-Macias, professor of government and public policy at Cornell University and the former director of public affairs with Mexico's Consumer Protection Agency. And it's great of the three of you to join us on TVO here tonight. Before we talk about Mexico's democratic future, we do have to talk about the border because it's been such a huge issue for so long. Lorena, I want to start with you. You're a pollster. You know, we all know that Americans living close to that border with the United States and Mexico are distressed at the state of affairs. Donald Trump, of course, made great hay about that issue, turning it into a big winner for his presidential campaign. What about Mexicans, though? Is the border an issue for them?
Well, basically, hi, it's a pleasure to be with all of you. Basically, the border is mostly a problem for people living on the border. So we do have to think about Mexico in different segments of the population. The North has developed a lot more economically, specifically in certain terms. The center of the country is positioned differently, and the South has been the one that has lagged behind economically more. So we expect right now, what we see in surveys is that the people in the North are the most distressed with what's happening in the border. They associate immigration to a lot of crime, a lot of insecurity, and a lot of government inefficiency. So this is an issue that President Lopez Obrador is going to have to deal with. Okay.
Gustavo, I'm told that as of 2018, half of illegal residents in the United States are Mexican citizens. Half. Talk to us about the economic significance of Mexicans, both legal and illegal, living in the United States and their significance to the Mexican economy.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you again for having me. There's quite a bit of significance economically. Mexicans that come to the U.S. Often play a really important role sending remittances back to Mexico. And the amount of remittances and the importance for the Mexican economy has increased, gradually but steadily over time. This is during the pandemic, for example, there was a big concern because all of the remittances were interrupted and there was a real dip. But they've come back roaring. And back in Mexico, for families, for households, they really make a difference. Now, in terms of the economic impact of Mexicans working in the U.S., for the U.S., on the U.S. side, I mean, we see that the U.S. population is experiencing this slowdown in terms of the growth of sort of the native born. And there's this real sense that increasingly the U.S. requires just labor at all levels, right? Sort of qualified and perhaps low skilled as well. And Mexican migrants fulfill that role across the board. It has been an important aspect in keeping the economy going in the U.S. And, inflation is a big concern right now in the U.S. Cheap labor certainly has helped keep inflation down. And it's something that, people are now reacting to. But Mexican migrants in the U.S. play such a crucial role in keeping prices down.
Very good. Now, with that background in place, we're going to turn our attention to the issue at hand, the increasingly controversial president of Mexico. And David Frum, I'll bring you in on this. I read your, well, in my view, superb piece in The Atlantic. This really sums up in an excellent fashion all of the troubles that the country is having right now. But let me set up my question to you by just reading an excerpt from your piece in The Atlantic from a couple of months ago. Mexico's erratic and authoritarian president, Andrés Manuel Lopez Obrador, is scheming to end the country's quarter-century commitment to multi-party liberal democracy. He is subverting the institutions that have upheld Mexico's democratic achievement, above all, the country's admired and independent election system. On Lopez Obrador's present trajectory, the Mexican federal elections, scheduled for the summer of 2024, may be less than free, and far from fair. If Lopez Obrador succeeds in manipulating the next elections in his party's favor, he will do more damage to the legitimacy of the Mexican government and open even more space for criminal cartels to assert their power. Okay, David, let's understand this, because he can't run for re-election next year. So what damage do you fear that he can do?
Well, let me just begin by asserting my own personal stake in this. Unlike your other guests, I don't have a personal connection to life in Mexico. But I was present at the beginning of the transition to multi-party democracy. In the elections of 2000 in Mexico, for the power transitioned from a president of one party to a president of another party by means of a free and fair, peaceful election, something that had never before happened in the nearly 200-year history of the Mexican state. That miraculous, breathtaking event was honored by a visit to the White House by the incoming president, Vicente Fox, in the fall of 2001. And I remember seeing him on the south lawn of the White House. I was working there at the time, and being in a big crowd of well-wishers and excited people. And this was part of the global democratic transformation that we so admired in those days. But this one was especially intimate because it was so close at hand. And Mexico is a country that has so many opportunities, but has had such struggles. In the year 2000 and 2001, it really seemed like a page had been turned, and Mexico was going to on its way to catch up to the developed world. If the Mexican economy had grown from the time Mexico entered NAFTA in the middle 1990s until now, at even a quarter the speed of the Chinese economy over those years, Mexico would now be looking very like a country in Southern Europe, that level of development. And that's the heartbreaking thing. What are we afraid of now in Mexico? When you talk about the subversion of democracy, it may conjure up the idea of some kind of authoritarian dictatorship. That's not really the thing to worry about the most. The thing to worry about the most is that in his attempt to snuff out democratic institutions, the current president, Lopez Obrador, is going to weaken even further the already weak Mexican state and lose power to criminal organizations. Mexico has always suffered from a weak state, a state that can't make its authority run, that can't protect people, that can't collect taxes. Democracy is a huge asset for a state. It gives the state legitimacy. It answers the question, well, why should I pay your taxes? Well, you voted for it. That's why you should pay the taxes. If Lopez Obrador continues to do unto Mexico what he's been doing, you could see not a return to the kind of heavy-handed authoritarianism of the past, but to a breakdown of authority that opens the way to all kinds of criminal elements who already are so present in so many areas of Mexico's territory.
But Lorena, just a quick follow-up. Nobody's concerned that he's going to change the law and allow himself to run for another term. Are people concerned about that?
He is not seeking re-election. What he has done, as David has said, he's been dismantling a lot of counterweight powers. The autonomous institutions that used to regulate the energy sector, the telecom sector. Lopez Obrador is a president who does not like limits. He does not like external limits. He does not like oversight. He does not tolerate criticism. And even from the press, like he has been systematically attacking the press. Since he controlled Congress for the first half of his term, then he was very happy with the way he was passing laws. He lost the constitutional majority after the midterm elections, and this put him in a different mindset. So what he has tried to do right now is completely dismantle the National Electoral Institute, which was the safeguard of our democracy. This institution was approved by the majority of the population. It has run elections freely and fairly. It has supervised elections. These elections are conducted by the citizens, and it has even managed to succeed in conducting elections in states that have been plagued by organized crime, like Tamaulipas. So it has been a very successful element of democracy.
But Lorena, let me jump in on that for a second, because I know that you're a pollster, so you will appreciate this. Morning Consult, which is an organization that did polling around the world, they polled 22 countries. He's the third most popular leader in the world, behind only Modi of India and Berset of Switzerland. I mean, he's over 60%. Joe Biden and Justin Trudeau would give their eye teeth for those kinds of numbers. What makes him so popular?
But in Mexico, we have to look at our history. In Mexico, most presidents are popular. Since 2000, which is what we consider a democratic period, since Vicente Fox, even since 1994 with Cedillo, where we had our first divided government, etc., most presidents have been around high 50s, low 60s. The only exception was Enrique Peña Nieto, the president who was former to Lopez Obrador. So in Mexico, we have to put those numbers in context. That does not mean that he has a blank check to do whatever he wants. And that's why we have seen a lot of opposition. We saw him have a very important electoral defeat in 2021, not only in the congressional elections, but in specific cities and in Mexico City and in the state of Mexico. So we have to put that in perspective. For advanced democracies, for industrial democracies, these are high numbers. In Mexico, and generally, presidents are well liked. We are very lenient with our presidents, and we don't have re-election. So, that doesn't necessarily turn into electoral numbers. Ernesto Cedillo, who had high approval ratings, had to turn over power to Vicente Fox, which was from a different party, and Felipe Calderón had to do the same. He turned over to the PRI. So we have to put that in context.
Understood. Gustavo, can he say that he has improved the lives of the average Mexican citizen?
Well, it really depends on which dimension we're talking about. David mentioned earlier some of the challenges that Mexico faces, and I think he's correct in pointing these out. But it's also worth, as Lorena mentioned, taking a longer view. And many of these challenges have been around much before Lopez Obrador, right? Some of them, the issue of crime or immigration or the trade relationship with the U.S. These are challenges that are ongoing, and some of them become more or less salient depending on the presidential period. I think it's safe to say that there are important sectors of the population that truly believe that there has been an improvement in the way things are going. And then, I think it's important to look at the numbers, right? I focus mostly on the issue of crime and government responses to crime. That's what my research is about. And, there's a real sense that this increasing trend that was taking place in Mexico in terms of violent crime has at least reached some form of inflation point and has stopped increasing as much, has stabilized. I think if you ask most people would still say that's not quite enough. Lopez Obrador, the current president, promised a real change in terms of violent crime and how it was affecting Mexicans. But many people point to that and say, look, it's not as bad as it used to be. There's also an important perception when it comes to corruption. And, corruption perceptions are important. I don't think corruption is any different today than it was 6 years ago, 12 years ago, 18 years ago in Mexico. It has been such an important challenge for Mexico. But the perception is important. And I think this is changing the way people see their relationship with government. So for vast sectors of the population, and this is why Lopez Obrador is so popular, they truly think that government is working for them in ways that the government didn't before. And this may be a matter of perception, but it's something that explains why the opposition has had such a difficult time putting forth real alternatives to this project.
Well, David, let me follow up with you on the crime angle in this, because you referred to it, or at least I guess I referred to it at the end of that excerpt of your piece in The Atlantic that I just read. In what ways do you see Obrador creating more space for criminal cartels in today's Mexico?
Well, let's give a sense of how extreme the crime problem is in Mexico. So in the United States, which Canadians think it was a very violent society, about 330 million people and about 20,000 homicides a year. 20,000 in a country of 330 million. Mexico's got a population about a third that of the United States, and it had 35,000 homicides, half again as many. Okay, well, that's pretty shocking, but here's what's even more shocking. Out of every 100 homicides in Mexico, about 5 end up with some kind of resolution, some kind of charge being brought, some kind of process, some kind of resolution. 95 out of 100 homicides, nothing happens. The homicide leads to no result. When you talk about Lopez Obrador and what he's done for ordinary people, one of the things that people in Canada will know about Lopez Obrador, this is the way he's always described in our press, the left-leaning president of Mexico. So when you hear that, that makes you think, well, he must be some kind of social democrat or socialist. He must be trying to bulk up the social insurance state, paying more. None of that is true. Actually, what Lopez Obrador has done is to squeeze what there is of a Mexican social insurance system. And what he has done instead, and this is part of the secret of his popularity. Look, if you're in a developed country, your entitlement to the benefits of the state exists whatever your attitude to the government. Whether you like the prime minister or the president or the king or whatever, if you're a citizen of Canada or the United States or Norway or any other country, your rights and entitlements are exactly the same as a critic. No special advantage. What Lopez Obrador has tried to do is dismantle all the parts of the state that are impersonal, everything that is social insurance, and build instead a new form of income supplement that is personal, that depends on your attitude toward him. This is how it was in the bad old days. If you supported him, you got a pension. If you didn't, you didn't. If you supported him, you got some kind of, and your child was sick, you had access to a hospital. If not, not. Now, the old Mexican social insurance system was inadequate. Mexico could easily have afforded more. Mexico is not a desperately poor country. It's middle income by global standards. And many countries that are poorer than Mexico do a much better job of general social provision than Mexico has done. But Mexico's problem has always been that authority is too personal and the state is too weak. And Lopez Obrador is making the state more weak and making the authority more personal. But he's not building some kind of big social welfare system. That doesn't interest him at all.
Gustavo, we should talk about the drug trade. And here's a headline from the Mexico Daily News from a few days ago. The headline is, "As fentanyl deaths rise, Mexico and the U.S. lack cooperation." Question, do you think Mexico could be doing more to stop fentanyl from crossing the American border?
Certainly. I think the Mexican government relies quite a bit on this notion that, there are all these external forces that are to blame for what's happening in the country. And it often points the finger at the United States and sort of the consumption issue, certainly, and also the flow of guns and weapons that cartels use into Mexico. But there's plenty of blame to go around within the Mexican system. David was pointing to how few cases actually reach court, and impunity in Mexico reigns supreme. I think that's one of the main challenges in this country, that drug cartels always take advantage of this. There's very little accountability for politicians and public officials who help out cartels, who are in bed with criminal organizations. And that's a major challenge. So the Mexican government can certainly do more, in terms of regulating substances, the importing of substances from China, from other parts of the world. It can certainly do more in terms of addressing the public safety issue from a civilian perspective, strengthening civilian institutions and the judicial system, as opposed to sort of this militarized approach that in part has been encouraged by the United States, not only in Mexico, but in Latin America and other parts of the world, that seems to be this easy and very popular solution to organized crime. But the reality is that there's plenty of evidence that militarized approaches do very little to improve public safety. So a real commitment to strengthening institutions that are civilian in nature and the judicial sides of things to address impunity would certainly go a long way.
Lorena, I hate to put it this crudely, but is a drug-addicted United States of America good for the Mexican economy?
It would be hard for me to speak to that. What I can say is the public perspective on the current strategy to combat organized crime is that it has failed. Actually, it's one of the worst numbers of President Lopez Obrador's presidency in general. When we talk about economy, when we talk about job creation, when we talk about social programs, which are very important, as David was saying, the worst part of his presidency has to do with how he has handled organized crime. And he has had this policy that he says hugs, not gunshots. Most of the population disapprove of this policy. And one of the reasons that it's not costing him right now electorally, or it's not costing him in approval ratings, has to do with the fact that no former president was able to succeed in this area. So in general, what we see in the population is that there seems to be sort of a loss of hope on what can happen. And what they're looking into is more regional approaches. They're starting to look at their governors, at their mayors, to try to solve this type of problem.
Let me do one more round on this drug issue, and I guess we'll start here with this tweet from the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs that came out a few days ago. It says, the U.S. has itself to blame for its domestic drug abuse. China supports Mexico in defending independence and sovereignty and opposing foreign interference. We're ready to work with Mexico and the rest of the world to counter cross-border drug crime. And David, maybe I'll bring you in on this. This was in response to Louisiana Senator John Kennedy's suggestion that the United States ought to send troops over the border into Mexico to deal with the drug cartels. Do you know if there's anybody at the highest levels of the American government taking that suggestion seriously?
Not of the present government, no. Although it's become a glib talking point among some Republican politicians. But I want to register protest against a phrase you used. You called them drug cartels. For the criminal cartels in Mexico, drugs are a very important line of business, but not the only one, and maybe not anymore even the most important one. They also smuggle people. They also steal natural resources. They also siphon off oil and electricity. And increasingly what they do, and this is the most worrying thing they do, is I don't think there's another word for it, they tax. In much of Mexico, in many, many parts of Mexico, they are the government. They collect protection money that functions as taxes. What security there is, they provide. If there's a dispute, you don't go to a court. The courts are useless. You'll never hear from the courts. They adjudicate in a corrupt way, but they adjudicate disputes. They are a kind of quasi-government. And to give you a sense of how powerful they are relative to the existing government, on the 6th of January of this year, the Mexican military arrested one of the sons of the famous criminal El Chapo. He was traveling in a convoy of, I think, 24 armed vehicles. And don't just think SUVs. These are flatbed trucks with 50-millimeter cannon on them. Army helicopter gunships attacked the convoy, and they did arrest him. But they started a gun battle that left, for every 2 of the criminals who were killed, a soldier died. I think it was 11 soldiers to 20 criminals. And after the arrest, the criminals went on a rampage through the capital of the state of Sinaloa and attacked the airport and fired bullets that penetrated civilian airliners. So the Mexican state remains the single strongest actor in the boundary of Mexico. But it's not like these cartels are almost alternative governments, and drugs are just one of their lines of business. So the question, and this is why things like that comment you quote are so goofy, what Mexico needs above all is state building. It needs to have a proper government. Mexico is an OECD country, part of that club of wealthy nations, that the world's 30, 40 wealthiest nations. On average, it taxes about half as much as an OECD country does. It doesn't have an effective military. It doesn't have an honest court system. It doesn't have an effective army. And so things that the state fails to provide the basics for people, and then criminals step in and act like alternative governments. Trafficking drugs, yes, but a lot of other things too.
You mentioned the military, and I want to pick up with Gustavo on that, because the president is broadening the military's mission, not just defending Mexico from enemies, but also they are economic players in the country. They build and manage the airport, for example, in Mexico City. What does it say about the place? What does all of that say, Gustavo, about the place of the Mexican military in the economy and the affairs of the country?
The Mexican military has really played a crucial role in this administration for not just domestic law enforcement, which is certainly very problematic, but also, as you pointed out, it has become involved in, some spheres that really the military should have very little to do. And now it's running port administrations, port authorities, it's running infrastructure projects, major airports, it's running even tourist sites and resorts. It is really permeating so many aspects of Mexican society. And this is really problematic. In Latin America, there's a long history of militaries coming into power through military coups, through violence. And what this government is doing is really opening the door entirely to an institution that is very opaque in the way that it operates. There's very little oversight, and one that enjoys quite a bit of trust coming from the Mexican population. So the military is now at the center of government decisions, even questions of science and technology and which scholarships are assigned. The military has a seat at the table. So in most democratic societies, at least in liberal democracies, this would be considered excessive. And it does not bode well in the sense that whenever a government decides that the military has gone too far, even short of a military coup, how is that civilian government going to roll back this presence? How is this civilian government going to check the role of the military and try to establish a balance in civil-military relations? So this is extremely problematic for Mexico. And unfortunately, the trend continues to be one of increasing roles and resources rather than the other way around.
All right, Lorena, let's look forward. We've already mentioned the fact that the president cannot run to succeed himself. So in about 14 months' time, there are going to be elections. And could you give us a sense about what the options are for the Mexican people when that national election happens next July?
So right now we have an option from Morena, the president's party, clearly. I think that the strongest option is the mayor of Mexico City, Claudia Sheinbaum, and I think that's the president's choice. We also have an alliance between the PAN, the PRI, and the PRD, which is like an ideologically all over the place alliance. But they have performed, I think, successfully or satisfactorily in the last local elections. And we may have an alternative option, which is a social democratic option, which is called Movimiento Ciudadano, that has some important figures. And we have to see whether they form an entire, like a broad opposition alliance. I think what we have to think about are the scenarios of what the next presidency is going to look like. One option is a president from Morena, with like a strong president with a majority in Congress. I think that is not the most likely option. I think it's very likely that the next president is not going to have the 53% that Lopez Obrador had in 2018. Another option is a president of Morena with a divided government. I think that is a very likely option. The next option is an opposition president with a Morena Congress. I think that's maybe less likely, but it is an option that's out there. And the rest of the options, like an opposition president with a strong government, with a strong Congress, are very, very unlikely. So I think that's what we're looking at. The thing is that the 2024 election is one of the largest that our country will ever see, because we have Congress, we have 9 governor races, and we have a lot of municipal elections. And the fact that people are looking at their local leaders really has a lot at play, because we see split tickets, we see the local arena affecting the federal arena. So I think it may turn into a very interesting election.
Gustavo, I do need to ask you about the Morena candidate that the president hopes will succeed him, Claudia Sheinbaum. Mexico's never had a female president. They've never had a Jewish president. What do the people think about that possibility?
Well, I think it depends who you ask. It's interesting the way you put it, that she seems to be perhaps the president's preferred candidate. And even that is very contested, right? I think there are at least a couple of others that people point to as being also within maybe the top 3 candidates that the president would have in mind. Another important one is the current Minister of Foreign Affairs, Marcelo Ebrard, who has been part of the president's project for quite some time now, and something would also have a strong chance at becoming president. It really will depend on what the primary results will show. That it looks like there will be some polling mechanism, some survey mechanism in order to determine who will be the next person. But if it happens to be the mayor of Mexico City, certainly some people point to the first female president, the first perhaps president of a Jewish president, or different backgrounds than most of the presidents we've had. I think it would be something that the Morena, I'm going to call it the machinery, the electoral machinery of Morena, of the party, the clientelism, these things play such an important role in Mexico that whoever wins the primary, whether it's Sheinbaum or Ebrard or someone else, I think will have a pretty strong chance of becoming president. And that certainly, people will have to decide. But I think it'll be a really interesting race at the very least, certainly the primary, and then to see whether the opposition is able to mount a compelling project, which there aren't a ton of signs of that at this point, unfortunately.
Okay, with just a couple of minutes left here, David, I want you to take us into Washington, D.C. You know how that town works. We know their they're quite focused when it comes to Mexico on the refugee issue at the border, but are they focused enough on some of the democratic deficit issues that you have expressed so well in your Atlantic piece? What do you think?
Can I pick up on those last two questions? This is, I think, a thing where Canadians really need to be focused most as partners with Mexico and NAFTA and as effective neighbors. What is Lopez Obrador's end game? The cultural taboo against staying more than 6 years is strong, and I don't think he will break it. His plan is to find ways to extend his power beyond his 6 years. That's been done before in Mexico City. Lopez Obrador is a close student of Mexican history. There was a president in the 1920s who left office on time and then continued to run Mexico behind the scenes through his control of party machinery, the army, and the economy. That's Lopez Obrador's plan. Why does he? It's so breathtaking. Mexico is going to have the first female Jewish president. That's so inspiring. That makes her weak. That's why he wants her. The army is being put into all these things that invite corruption, where the army is going to control customs and be taking bribes and be deprofessionalized. That's not a mistake. That's what he wants, because his vision is he will leave office in 2024. And then, like his predecessor of a century ago, he hopes to control the army because he will know every dirty secret in the army, because he's introduced the dirty secrets in the army. He'll have a successor who will be beholden to him. He's also introduced a provision where she's subject to recall at the halfway through her presidency. And he controls the party that will do the recalling. And she will be someone who's very different from the way Mexican presidents have traditionally been in the past. And those are other things that make her weak and subject to his control. So his plan is to keep power while giving up office. It's been done before, not in 100 years, but that is going to be the new Mexico. And the price of this attempt to exercise power in this way that will not seem legitimate to Mexicans is the continuing retreat of this weak state and the continuing opening up of spaces for these organized crime quasi-governments that do trade drugs but do other things too, to start exerting power all through the state. And this is going to be an enormous security problem for the United States and for Canada, and one that North Americans beyond Mexico's border and the many Mexicans who live outside, one out of every eight living Mexicans lives in the United States. Well, these are things that the whole community of the continent needs to take seriously.
As I said earlier, if people want more on this, they really should check out David Frum's piece in The Atlantic from the February edition. And I want to thank the three of you for coming on to TVO tonight and explaining this story to our viewers and listeners so well. Lorena Becerra, the political analyst, the head of public opinion research for one of Mexico's leading newspapers, Reforma. David Frum on the other end of the spectrum there, at least geographically, as I look at my television set right now, the staff writer for The Atlantic in Washington, D.C., Gustavo Flores-Macias, professor of government and public policy, Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. Muchas gracias, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.